Thank you very much, Brian. Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, members of the press. My name is Jim Kelly, and I am here today to introduce my paper, Parental Alienation and the Long-Term Effects of Hypercortisolism on Children in Custody Decisions. And it represents a study that identifies 63% of the population of children either alienating or watching siblings alienate a parent. And all the children are accepting this as normal these days because so many of them are doing it. It isn't normal. It is also not an aberrant pathology as sometimes is referred to in psychology. With 63% of children actively alienating a parent or watching a sibling do it, it's a naturally occurring defense mechanism in response to the covert domestic violence by proxy of the children towards an ex-spouse. Now, while I'm male, let me make this very clear that this domestic violence is gender neutral and frequently goes unrecognized and even accepted by those being abused. In order to understand this form of domestic violence better, I will explain a brief history of parental alienation, the science on it, how I believe that it should be defined, and go through some of the other details on that. Now, in 1932, Sandor Ferenczini, one of Sigmund Freud's contemporaries, spoke about, in a speech, Confusion of the Tongues, in 1932 at the 12th Congress of Psychology. He spoke about incest, and he did that and mentioned identification with the aggressor. Now, incest is a betrayal trauma. So is parental alienation. So there are certainly some very significant similarities in that respect. And as you fast forward to 1985, you have Dr. John Gardner, who coined the term parental alienation that became very popular. Now, Dr. John Gardner published that in the summer of 1985. It was a self-publication. There was no peer review on it. He didn't define the term. He started on page 3 referring to the term as the action of a child, and then later in the paper as the action of adults. He did not cite a single citable reference in the paper anywhere. It is the very definition of junk science. To this date, I have not seen a useful definition of parental alienation that describes exactly how it impacts the child as a defense mechanism. Now, I want you to think about defense mechanisms. It's a cold day today. If we're here without a coat, we shiver. That's a defense mechanism against the cold. So you have to look and ask yourself, with 63% of the children out there using a defense mechanism, what are they defending against? Well, in 1998, the CDC commissioned a study with Kaiser Permanente. There was a landmark study that's commonly referred to as the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And what it did is it showed the correlation between adverse childhood experiences, of which parental alienation and the situation that surrounds it is clearly an adverse childhood experience, with adverse health effects later on in life. But they did not show causality. That study was published 20 years ago, and there still hasn't been causality shown for that. And that disturbs me. So my definition for parental alienation is the action that a child takes to minimize or sever a relationship with a normal range, interested, and available fit parent when grieving the ambiguous loss of that parent becomes less emotionally painful than the combination of emotional, psychological, and possibly physical abuse from the other parent in a normal range defense mechanism that attempts to mediate a hypercortisolemic injury resulting from the prolonged and elevated levels of the primary human stress hormone cortisol that are induced by the abuse and its effects. Let me be clear. Parental alienation is not abuse. Parental alienation is a defense mechanism for that abuse. Parental gatekeeping is abuse that is clearly involved in this situation. Parental gatekeeping is just one form of emotional abuse by the pathogenic parent that attempts to isolate the targeted parent from their children, the most extreme form of which is filicide, where the parent kills the children. This occurs in this country 500 times a year. To understand parental alienation and how the psychoneuroendocrinology of hypercortisolism relates to that, and let me simplify that term for you. Hypercortisolism is an elevation of the primary human stress hormone cortisol. It's what happens when we get stressed. If it happens once in an extreme situation, well, it's a healthy adaptation for your fight, flight, and freeze response. That's okay. That helps us survive. But when that happens over and over and over again every day, it raises the cortisol levels to neurotoxic levels that actually changes the structure of the brain. And in doing so, it changes the behavior. So you have a field that is really not being paid attention to in science. And that's a big issue. So to go back and to explain how parental alienation happens, I'm going to use two parents as an explanation. Pat and Terry. Now, parental alienation is gender neutral, and so are these names. Pat is the pathogenic parent. Terry is the targeted parent. What happens when they're together is that you have two loving parents. Now, when they separate, well, the child still loves both parents, and everything's okay. However, when Pat chooses to abandon the role of loving parent in favor of being a captor and identifies Terry as a threat and the child as a victim, which all happens simultaneously, that sets up a very complex dynamic. Now, it's described in various literature as, gee, there's a cross-generational coalition between Pat and the child, which can be considered the identification with the aggressor, Pat being the aggressor. That's absolutely the way it goes. But if you look at it in a more detailed foundational manner, underneath that cross-generational coalition, there is betrayal trauma. And in that betrayal trauma, there are 5 components. Those 5 components dissected, each one raises the cortisol level ever so slightly. So you have the 2 different views. That's called cognitive dissonance, because to the child, each view seems real. Pat is the loving parent. Pat is also their captor. Terry is their loving parent. Terry is the threat. That's uncomfortable for the child. That raises their stress level. The child also suffers the ambiguous loss of both parents. Not one parent, both parents. Ambiguous loss is not something that's commonly discussed. It's a grieving process that goes on indefinitely. It's not a parent that died and they grieve the loss and they move on. They grieve the loss every day. And what an ambiguous loss is you have a parent, Pat, that's physically present but emotionally absent. You have another parent, Terry, that is physically absent but emotionally present. Those are the 2 forms of ambiguous loss defined by Pauline Boss. And the child suffers both of these. In an environment of covert domestic violence, of at least covert domestic violence, if not physical violence. So you have the pathogenic parent, Pat, that wants to attack Terry, but they're separated, and that can't happen. So Pat does it by proxy of the children. You have covert domestic violence by proxy of the children. Those are 5 components of the betrayal trauma of parental alienation. Now, each one elevates the cortisol level because the child is stressed by each one of those. In order for the child to mediate the damage, very much like a child without a coat today would shiver to mediate the cold, what they do is they adopt the shared delusion of the pathogenic parent Pat that Terry is the threat. So it resolves the cognitive dissonance. That reduces 2 levels. It also reduces covert domestic violence by proxy of the child. That takes down 3 of the 5. The ambiguous loss of both parents is still left. Now, even if that child years later reconnects with the targeted parent, and that resolves the ambiguous loss there, this ambiguous loss will always be there while Pat is still a pathogenic parent. Now, these hypercortisolemic wounds are not necessarily permanent. You can heal from them to some degree. There will always be a vulnerability, and it causes personality shifts from normal people with empathy to having empathy impairments and using narcissistic defense mechanisms. And it's understanding these narcissistic defense mechanisms where you identify, okay, there's an empathy impairment here, there's a personality disorder, there's an issue. And unfortunately, you have a lot of that goes on. And in terms of this narcissistic behavior that even adults exhibit, there are rules that are the seeds for parental alienation. There are 7 unwritten rules. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, don't remember, don't resolve, don't touch, and don't have boundaries. This makes it an absolutely excellent target for somebody exhibiting these narcissistic defense mechanisms to use and to justify their reality. However, they're also the seeds for parental alienation. When you look at parental alienation and you look at the environment that it occurs in, there are 6 characteristics of that environment. Without the 6, it's not going to happen. The first is dependence. The child is dependent upon the parents. There are many people that will speak about Stockholm Syndrome, in which case the adult people are as dependent as children on the hostage takers. Dependence is a requirement. An empathy impairment is a requirement. In addition to that, you've got a high conflict situation that is either naturally occurring or is created by the attorneys. Those 3, the courts have no control over. However, the next 3, the courts do very much have control over. The unequal footing of the parents in the courtroom as custodial and non-custodial parents very much mirrors the hostage takers and the police in a hostage situation. So that's another format, another part of the 6. You have partial isolation of the children, very much like the hostages are isolated. And you have a situation of violence, even if it's covert domestic violence that's regarded as, well, that's the adversarial situation. You know, it's an adversarial process. The courts facilitate the covert domestic violence, as you'll see by a lot of what's behind me. So in the environment of those 6, when you trace it back down to what fundamentally supports that in the U.S. family court system, you arrive at Title 4D. Title 4 is part of the Social Security Act that was passed into legislation in 1935. And between 1935 and today, until this paper, never once has it been considered within the scientific literature that is overseen by, largely, by the Department of Health and Human Services, who also oversees the federal distribution of child support. Not once has there ever been a paper in support or against Title IV from a psychological standpoint, whether it does greater harm to the population or whether it doesn't. Now, within the literature, you have, back in 1932, Dr. Harvey Cushing, that identified Cushing's disease as a function of a tumor on the pituitary gland that increased the ACTH level and ultimately the cortisol level, producing hypercortisolism and Cushing syndrome. Since then, you've had subclinical hypercortisolism that has been described in the scientific literature as a function of incidental adenomas, smaller tumors, that are considered within the normal range, and we'll get back to that in a minute. You have a lot of people with Cushing's disease that are having trouble getting diagnosed today because of, well, what's the normal range? You have, since the late 1940s, early 1950s, exogenous corticosteroids, meaning from outside the body. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid or a corticosteroid from within the body. Prednisone is the most popularly prescribed corticosteroid that 1% of the US population is on. And because of that, you have these adverse side effects. If you look at the label on the prednisone on drugs.com, you'll see exactly what the adverse side effects of hypercortisolism are and how it can affect every system within the body. And when they look at the subclinical version of that for somebody who's on it at short term, well, okay, that's just an adverse side effect. So that's the subclinical version of exogenous hypercortisolism. There is a third form. It is pseudo Cushing syndrome. There's no tumor. There's no exogenous glucocorticoids being taken. There is Cushing syndrome as a function of stress. And that stress is typically found in the population of alcoholics. 5% of alcoholics are identified within the literature as having pseudo Cushing syndrome. What the literature is completely silent on is subclinical stress-induced hypercortisolism. Well, the whole court process is stressful. To parents, it's stressful for children. Suicide was spoken about just a short while ago. When you understand major depressive disorder, you understand that the uncinate fasciculus part of the brain, the white matter on the left side, is associated with major depressive disorder. The uncinate fasciculus is adversely affected by glucocorticoids. So is the hippocampus. The hippocampal volume is reduced, and that reduction is associated with an increase in anxiety. You've got your prefrontal cortex that's also affected because there's a high concentration, although not as high as the hippocampus, you've got a high concentration of glucocorticoid receptors there. This is part of the affective empathy circuit in the brain. And as a function of damaging the empathy circuit, well, now you have the personality shift. And this is commonly what you see in the high conflict court situations. And that personality shift, it can come back. It's plastic, but it's a function of how stress is harming the population. If you look at, and I've prepared something else here, let me briefly go over some of the adverse health effects. First of all, domestic violence is associated with cortisol imbalances between the couples. So that's in the literature. You have substance abuse, alcoholism, smoking, and sexual behavior, promiscuous sexual behavior identified within the ACE study that is all part of the addiction cycle that cortisol is implicated in. You've got obesity, which is a primary sign of hypercortisolism, as being in epidemic quantities in the U.S. population. You've got adversely affected physical activity, depression I've spoken about, associated with suicide. You've got social, emotional, and cognitive impairment as a function of the damage to the hippocampus. COPD within the ACE study is something that I have not seen associated directly, but would anticipate that at some point there will be a change of genetic expression linked with COPD, as was done with cancer. Excess levels of glucocorticoids change the genetic expression of the p53 gene, the tumor suppressor gene, making cancer more likely to take hold. You've got ischemic heart disease that's related. You have kidney disease, diabetes. You've got musculoskeletal injuries in terms of osteoporosis. You've got a shortened life expectancy that can be identified within shortened telomere length. All of this is identified with hypercortisolism. Now, you have a couple of things that are missing from the literature, and it's quite surprising. One of those things I said I'd get back to, and it's understanding what normal cortisol levels are. There's a U-shaped curve, and you'll see it on my website. I published the paper on my website. If you scan that QR code, you'll go directly to my website, and you'll see a graph. It's going to be the first and the second graph. The first graph shows the U shape of what the cortisol relationship is with health. If your cortisol level is too low, you have Addison's. If it's lower than that, you go into an Addisonian crisis or an adrenal crisis. And eventually, if that's not treated very quickly, it will kill you. Now, on the other side of that, you have the adverse health effects associated with subclinical hypercortisolism, with hypercortisolism like Cushing syndrome, and eventually death. The bottom of that U-shaped curve, you have optimum health. So you shouldn't strive for no cortisol because that will kill you. You should strive for optimum cortisol. But the question becomes, what is optimum cortisol? What is the normal distribution of basal cortisol, the base level of cortisol, look like? Well, I searched the literature for a large cohort study to understand what that basal cortisol level was. There isn't a study on it. Not one, anywhere in the literature. The normal distribution should be a bell curve where the peak of that bell curve is directly over the bottom of the U. There's no study that validates that. There should be a study that validates, sorry, it's a windy day. There should be a study that validates this not only in the context of what the normal distribution is, but with 63% of the children identified as either alienating or having a sibling alienate a parent. You've got a significant portion of the population with an increased stress level. If you look at the parents inclusive of that, and this isn't counting any children that have aged out of the system, you're looking at 21% of the US population that is suffering an increased stress level. You would expect that normal distribution to shift towards the hypercortisolemic end of the spectrum and be lifted. And that would be figure 2 in that on that website, endparentalgatekeeping.com, since it's fallen down. If you look at that and you realize within the literature there's an ongoing disagreement with where the boundaries of subclinical hypercortisolism are. Where do we define somebody as being the high normal? And where do we define them as being subclinical? And where do we define them as, okay, now you've met the threshold for Cushing's, and we need to go and look for either the cause as a tumor, or do you have factitious Cushing syndrome, where you're surreptitiously taking glucocorticoids, and you actually have an addiction to glucocorticoids like prednisone? So they need to go and take a look at what the next step is. But there's confusion within the literature because there is no reference point to what normal distribution should look like. So I find it curious as to why this work hasn't been done already. Who am I to be the first one in over 80 years to go and point this out? Why hasn't science, with all of the minds and the degrees in science, come up with a better answer? Why haven't they looked into this? Dr. Block of the CDC has been identified as saying, the American Academy of Pediatrics, I believe, has been identified as saying that this is the single largest unaddressed health issue facing this country today. And yet, it's still unaddressed. And nobody has linked it to parental alienation before today. I've got a problem with that. And when I look to see, okay, the CDC came out with the ACE study in 1998. Why didn't they follow up on it? Why didn't they find causality? The CDC is overseen by the Health and Human Services Department. Well, who else is overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services? You've got the National Institute of Health that oversees the funding for studies, a lot of the studies out there. And let's face it, these scientists that are going to do the research need the funding to do it. Okay, they also oversee the largest database, PubMed.gov. All right. They also oversee, among other things, the federal distribution of child support. Is this an issue for anybody? It's an issue for me. I'm not happy with this. The paper that I've produced is over 13,000 words. Normally, I would have liked to have subjected it directly to peer review. However, peer review was initially started back in, about 400 years ago. And if you go back to the time of Copernicus, Copernicus suggested the blasphemous idea that the heavens do not revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. He didn't publish until the day he died. A couple of years later, you had Galileo that followed up, and Galileo said, I support that idea. Well, the powers that be didn't like that. They put him under house arrest. The powers that be also said, we need to control the information that gets out. We need to censor that. We need to create peer review. Well, that's what they did. And peer review has existed to support the ideas within the field of science, and I do believe in that. But when the process of peer review eliminates works of a particular size, my paper is 13,000 plus words, well, now there's a de facto censorship. And to go and consider the topic from the multidisciplinary perspective that I've done, which includes the psychoneuroendocrinology of hypercortisolism, the psychology of parental alienation and filicide, addiction, law and domestic violence, well, you can't trim it down but so much. So I published it on my website. Now, I believe that what we're seeing here is not necessarily a conspiracy, but more the unintended consequences of a law that was meant to protect the weakest of our population, our children. And I don't think that there's enough knowledge, and I don't think that there's enough education on the topic for most people to speak intelligently on it. And this disappoints me. So that's why I've written this paper. That's why I've published this paper. I want to create that discussion. I'll create that discussion in academia. I'll challenge any professional to peer review my paper, and as long as you stick with scientific citations and you put the merits of the case, you discuss your financial interest in the field, and quite honestly, I have none. I do not make my money in the field. You discuss your contribution to science, and you allow me to publish any of that, good or bad. As long as you're basing it on the scientific foundation, I will publish that, and I will defend my thesis on my website, and parentalgatekeeping.com. Now, to move forward, I believe that fundamentally Title IV and the health effects that it creates in this context is a constitutional crisis requiring judicial review at the federal level. I believe that this information is fundamental for those children that have been adversely affected by the system and that sue the states for that harm caused to them. And when they need to litigate against the states and show harm, this is the pathway to doing that. I believe that the legislators that write the laws need to be held accountable for knowing this information. I believe the judges responsible for making the decisions in the courtrooms must be accountable for knowing this information. And I believe that psychology as a profession must be held accountable for knowing this information. And either find me wrong or support it. The medical industry as a whole must do the same. I'm open to being found wrong. I've put this paper in front of experts privately. While there have been criticisms on the form of the paper, and certainly its length, not once has there been a challenge to the thesis. Not once. And these aren't just generic experts, these are experts at the top of their field. In closing, attorneys and other experts have challenged the very existence of parental alienation while profiting from it because the field of psychology has not historically been able to provide empirical evidence. That ends now. Ignorance ends now. Plausible deniability ends now. This paper, published on the website endparentalgatekeeping.com, is your tool to destroy the ignorance that surrounds parental alienation. When ignorance is destroyed, apathy and greed will follow, and the foundation for the mess that is the family court system and Title IV will have to be repealed as unconstitutional, because it can be shown that the long-term lasting effects cause more harm than the good of providing financial support for children. Amen. I believe that one voice can make a difference. There are many alienated parents that suffer from depression and believe they are powerless. They are not. They can share this information with others who suffer until everyone knows this. I wake up every morning and ask myself the same question. Would I walk through hell itself for my children, Rachel and Daniel? I always answer yes. And when I do, I get up and start walking. Walk with me. Thank you.